Out of the last 10 trading sessions, we've seen where we start higher but end up lower. That's been 7 or 8 times now that we've done that over the last 10 trading sessions. We ended up gapping higher and staying higher. We ended up closing higher by 207 points almost on the Dow, just under 0.5%. The S&P was up 0.78%, testing the 78.6 Fibonacci again, up 49 points to 63.89. The Nasdaq was up just under 1%, and the Russell was up 0.17. The VIX was down 8.5% to close just above 15. Again, Apple and Nvidia helping the Nasdaq and the market as a whole. We saw the weak earnings with Snap this week. We saw the weak earnings with AMD, Supermicro. Nasdaq had initially had some volatility surrounding that, but shrugged it off, focused on Apple and Nvidia. Apple had a good week. It's not moving to new highs, but it did jump, fill the gap, and it did get above that 200 period moving average. This week's going to be very important because we're going to get the inflation data. A few months ago, several months ago, I was predicting that we would see inflation bottom, hit the CPI, and begin to rise back up, and it's been rising ever since. I told you I thought it had bottomed a few months ago. It's supposed to continue that. CPI year over year is expected to come in at 2.8%, higher than the 2.7. Remember, it bottomed out, what was it, 2.3 or 4 when I called that bottom for the inflation data. I saw the core go sideways, but now it was hovering sideways for a couple readings there, and then we saw it tick up to 2.9 from the 2.8 reading, and now it's supposed to go to 3.1%. Again, actually, I think you're going to see an inflation freakout when we top in the coming months ahead. Jamie Dimon's crack in the bond market is going to happen. You're going to see a collapse in bonds and a spike in yields, and it will eventually lead to an inflation freakout. It will be blamed on tariffs. And I want to continue to point out, we've got these deals that we were told were never going to happen. We got the August 1st tariffs. I told you they were not going to be delayed. We have some negotiations going on with China and Mexico, and they're finishing and wrapping up some of these trade deals, but these trade deals are coming to a conclusion. Some of the deals still have tariffs, even though, and next week we're going to get possibly the semiconductor tariff announcement. That could be next week or the following week, but it could be next week. Going to hear more about pharma. Got in India's tariffs raised by 25% up to 50%. The market shrugged it off. And I think we still get this bigger pullback than what we've seen so far, and then we go and resume the advance, go make new highs, and peak in a couple of months. I think it's very, very likely that we're going to see an inflation freakout. Yields probably spike to new highs. The 10 years consolidating sideways, and what I think will eventually get an upward resolution. So the CPI, we'll see if we get that. That's going to be on Tuesday, August 12th. Thursday the 14th, we'll get the wholesale inflation. So next week we'll get the inflation data. The week after that, the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, we're going to get Thursday, Friday, Saturday, we're going to get the Fed at Jackson Hole. You're going to have Fed speakers. You know, it's not listed here, but it will likely be the Fed Chair Powell speaks on Friday, August 22nd. Usually the Fed Chair speaks on that Friday. Also get the FOMC minutes from the prior meeting next week, not this next week, but the week after that, pardon me, on August 20th. At the end of August, we'll get Nvidia earnings. If our seasonality plays out here, which is suggesting volatility in August, but then an August bottom to resume the advance, which I think is going to end up being correct. Again, it's not always correct. It wasn't correct in March. A lot of times in history where it's wrong. Even in July, we went up to rally early in July 3rd. Just didn't keep going. We went sideways on the S&P 500 for a couple of weeks, about 2.5 weeks or so. Then we got that final push higher, right into key resistance in the weekly and the daily time frame. Again, I still think that the seasonality is going to play out. We have Nvidia at resistance. We have the Nasdaq and the S&P at resistance. I do think that seasonality will play out. I think we'll see some kind of bottom in August. Bitcoin got a shallow pullback after its July peak, and it hit major support and bounced off of it. Again, we could see a shallow pullback for the market, probably bigger than the sell-offs that we've seen so far. Doesn't mean it can't be deeper, I think it's just going to be short-lived. We will see a bottom in August. See if our seasonality continues to play out here with volatility in August. I told you on Thursday that the NASDAQ signals are back to bullish. The S&P signals were mixed, but a lot of them were still bearish. They're turning back to bullish. I told you if we try to challenge the high, we would begin to see green bars or get a deeper retracement. NASDAQ moved just above that previous high. The S&P did not. The Dow did not. The Russell did not, closing back above the upper Bollinger Band, which I'll show you in a moment. Again, with the NASDAQ 100 being helped by Nvidia going back up and slamming up into resistance from the previous week where we turned off of it, and with help from Apple, hopping above the big rally and then hopping above its 200-period moving average, which helped Apple, and here's Apple's daily chart, which helped Apple get green bars on the oscillator and firm up. Apple's likely going to form a divergence here, gapping higher. Remember, we still have the death cross with Apple, the 50 still below the 200. I talked about this earlier in the week. I was watching the gap over here, as I mentioned previously, and we overthrew that. I was watching the 200-period moving average build that gap and overthrew the 200-period moving average. So that's helped the NASDAQ 100 and the market as a whole. So as I talked about in Thursday's video, we had a bullish reversal of conditions. Momentum has turned back to bullish. Trend signals have turned back to bullish as of Thursday. Now we're seeing that with the S&P, but we don't have the S&P moving to new highs yet. It still could. It's at major resistance, and so is the NASDAQ. NASDAQ moved just slightly above the previous peak, intraday high from the previous Thursday. Watching, does the S&P join it, testing the upper Bollinger Band again, as NASDAQ's currently doing right now, or diverge sometimes at tops and bottoms, longer term and short term tops and bottoms? NASDAQ and S&P diverge from one another. One of them goes higher and the other one doesn't. Do we see that here? It doesn't have to play out that way. The S&P may join the NASDAQ, just something to be aware of. So our high from July 31st, the last trading day of July, was taken out ever so slightly, but not on the S&P 500. The high from July 31st is still holding. It may be taken out. Signals remain bullish. Show you the signals. Do we get a few bars, green bars here, complete a divergence and then turn? It happened immediately. Still up at major resistance, just as we were over here. Nothing has changed. And we're slamming into that upper Bollinger Band again, closing just above the upper band in the daily time frame. I'll show it to you in a moment. Meanwhile, the Dow is still bearish, still below the 10 and 20 period, still has a bearish reversal of conditions with momentum. Awesome oscillator, still in negative territory. It did turn green. And we did have an up day. We were up just under 0.5%, up 206 points. But the Dow so far not moving to a new high like the NASDAQ. Now the same is true for the Russell. It's not moving to a new high. It still has a bearish reversal of conditions. What I'll be watching on the Dow and the Russell next week is, do they try to flip to a bullish reversal of conditions? We got it today on the S&P 500 on Friday. NASDAQ got it on Thursday. We end up getting a sell-off. Dow and the Russell remain bearish, and the S&P and NASDAQ revert back to bearish. One more look at the NASDAQ 100, and I'll show you the S&P 500. Again, we saw momentum turn back to bullish on Thursday, moving slightly above our previous high from July 31st. The S&P has not done that so far. Let me just say this. Again, I always talk about the MACD. One of the quirks about the MACD is when you get bearish crosses, you can go sideways. We saw that back over here in June. The NASDAQ. We saw it really on the S&P with July. We reached a peak in July and we went sideways, but just something to pay attention to as I try to curl back up or not, but momentum is back to bullish with NASDAQ. And then S&P gets a green bar as well on the awesome oscillator. I've talked about that Thursday. I talked about that possibility earlier in the week. We still have red bars, but you see the little arrow there. We closed above the upper boundary of the cloud, so we flipped the cloud back to green. So we did get a bullish reversal of conditions. The bar would have to validate that on Monday. If that is the case, you see the little arrow, and we're back above the 10-period moving average. Now, not making a new high, intraday high above this level. Remember, we had pushed 18 points above Tuesday's high, and we reversed and closed sharply lower. We're giving back all of that rally. What I'll be watching right now as we go into next week is, do we see a divergence develop between the NASDAQ and the S&P? May not play out that way. They both may move to a new high. The S&P may do it. Momentum is turning back to bullish now. Again, the MACD got a rollover, but one of the quirks with the MACD is sometimes you go sideways, which is what we're doing right now. And we're forming a head and shoulders pattern. If we end up getting a lower high, then we can still turn down with the lower high, moving back towards the 50 or maybe the 200 period moving average. Or does the S&P join NASDAQ 100 and we end up seeing another push above the upper band and end up getting one more reference point of a divergence? Right now, you have a lower high. NASDAQ's the only one out of the four that has moved to a new high, at least so far, being helped by Apple and Nvidia. In addition to the NASDAQ hitting a bullish reversal of conditions and the momentum line turning bullish on Thursday, the S&P had the same thing happen on Friday, got a bullish reversal of conditions, and the momentum line turned bullish on Friday. Here, momentum is still bearish after these divergences, but NASDAQ's at a new high, the S&P is not. Do they diverge from one another? Does the S&P join NASDAQ? See this shaded area? This is telling us that a squeeze move up or down is getting ready to happen. We're going in this sideways trading range. Here we still have red bars. We've got mixed signals. Do we see the S&P join the NASDAQ and go higher and slam up into resistance again? It's just below it. We hit it over here. We get a lower high and diverge with NASDAQ, as often is the case at reversals. It doesn't have to play out that way, but sometimes it does. I'm turning bullish on Friday. Will the squeeze move be up or will the squeeze move be down? And the bear flag, the new nation of the bear flag, I'm showing you in this video, will that play out or not? Is it a larger channel that takes us back up to the upper Bollinger Band in the daily time frame? So far, momentum still negative. The shaded area, the ribbon, momentum turning back to bullish. We can still try to challenge this high. NASDAQ moves slightly above it. Watching what happens as we go into next week with the CPI data. I told you we reached extremes with the RSIs in the daily time frame. You did it here on the NASDAQ 100 daily chart. You did it on the S&P. I told you there's still risk of a divergence developing if we don't get confirmation and a follow-through to a reversal. We got a reversal bar, we got confirmation, but no follow-through. Now we've inched up slightly above this level. We still may try to go higher as we form this divergence right here. But we're back above the upper Bollinger Band. So I'll be watching to see if we get a close below it, get our first green awesome oscillator bar, so it still may buy more time for the NASDAQ 100. The seasonality is likely going to play out, but it might be delayed. Likely see an August sell-off. Signals are back to bullish as of Thursday, so again, the risk is hold above the band and go higher and end up forming this divergence going into next week. So the MACD still might try to turn up and get another reference point of a divergence. We reached that extreme on the RSI with the S&P at 77. We came down to the 50 level. We're still holding above it. In order to just get a sell-off, you got to drop below these 50 levels, both here on NASDAQ, and we bounced off the 50 level, and on the S&P 500. So again, haven't moved to a new high. We're still below the band. Do they diverge from one another? The S&P joined the NASDAQ 100. So what becomes of the Dow and the Russell? Still have a bearish reversal of conditions. But watch the upper band on the NASDAQ 100. We'll be looking at the upper band here. Do we try to get back above it or do we make a lower high? Do the NASDAQ and S&P end up diverging from one another? As I've talked about over here, these Bollinger Bands, the upper Bollinger Bands, have been where the advance has stalled back in December, back in January, and then in February, where we ended up getting a bigger sell-off. We have the MACD having rolled over, but we've been going sideways. We've been forming a head and shoulders pattern, possible head and shoulders, if we end up seeing a downward resolution breaking below horizontal support. But you're getting a possible lower high unless the S&P joins the NASDAQ 100. Again, the MACD, when it rolls over, sometimes you go sideways. Over here, you saw it over here in May. We got the rollover, and it was bearish, and we just kind of went sideways. Tried to turn back up and formed a little tiny divergence. And again, MACD turning down, you corrected pulling back a little bit, but kind of in a sideways trading range. The July high went sideways, eventually rolled over, turned back up and formed that divergence there. So again, one of the quirks about the MACD, some rollovers can go sideways. Again, when it's positive, in positive territory above zero, you're likely in an uptrend. When you're in the negative region, you got a good chance that you're in a downtrend or going sideways. So I'll be watching the S&P 500 here, see if it goes up and tries to hit the upper band. If I bring it up close here, you can see this is the 20-period moving average. Here's the upper band. Rejection at it. That Thursday, the previous Thursday's high on the July 31st, and the Tuesday before that peak, again, getting rejection at that upper band. Let me just bring up NASDAQ 100 close up for you here. Got that black candlestick. I told you sometimes candlesticks that are black mark peak, but told you that momentum had turned back to bullish, so there was risk of taking out this high, which we did do just ever so slightly. We still may go higher because, again, momentum signals are now back to bullish, but again, just ever so slightly there. But we're slamming into major resistance in the weekly time frame. NASDAQ 100 was helped by Apple and Nvidia. Nvidia got that topping tail last week here just right under this long-term trend line, and we're there again. Rally back up after getting a gravestone doji the prior week, but it wasn't confirmed. And as I always say, again, candlesticks have to be confirmed and get a follow-through to mean anything. Bouncing off a trend line of support, when this trend line breaks, Selloff. I think we're going to end up selling up, but then going back up and flirting with this trend line again at even higher levels, where I think we're going to complete this broadening formation and complete a top on Nvidia. Now, this is all the data that we have on Nvidia since it started trading. I've talked about this long-term channel, and again, from these lows right here, we slightly violated that lower boundary right there. Then I've connected it from this high, and that's what we're slamming into. Our previous peak, and we're just below that right now, and we're forming a broadening formation. I think we're in a topping process here. I think we'll see a sell-off with Nvidia. Once the trend line breaks, then I think it'll go back up and slam up into this trend line again. We're just under it right now, as we saw a moment ago, up close and personal. And we have other interesting trend lines on Nvidia in the daily time frame. This trend line from our April low, we came back to it, and that's where we bounced. And again, when this trend line breaks, that's when we're going to get a bigger sell-off for Nvidia. But it was this trend line right here that we turned off of, this trend line connected to these previous highs right here, that we slammed right into there on July 31st and got that bearish boho candlestick, just like NASDAQ. It got confirmation, but no follow-through. If I bring up Nvidia close, you can see in the daily time frame here, we got that reversal bar, we got a confirmation to it, but no follow-through. We've come back up. We moved just slightly on Thursday above this previous bar right here, and ended up turning down. Rallied on Friday, helping the NASDAQ and the market, stalling at this area again. So weekly time frame, we are just directly under that trend line. There, if we go a little higher, we'll hit it, but we're directly under it. Longer term channel that I showed you. Here, we're right at horizontal resistance. Tested the previous high, but we failed to close above it. So I'll be watching, do we try to close above it before coming back and breaking this trend line right here on Nvidia. Nvidia continues to try to go a little higher, get another reference point of a divergence, sort of the trend line in the weekly time frame. Stack may go higher, hold above the upper band for a little bit longer, but it did close above it on Friday. So an important trend line to be watching on Nvidia. We bounced off of the trend line. Nvidia has major resistance overhead. So does the NASDAQ. So does the S&P 500. So it's still likely we're going to see our seasonality play out, even though we're going sideways with Nvidia, the NASDAQ, and the S&P. While momentum flipped back to bullish for the S&P on Friday, it did flip back to bullish on Thursday for the NASDAQ. Still bearish for the Dow and the Russell. We still have a bearish reversal of conditions, but we saw the NASDAQ move just slightly above this high right here. It still may go higher. Did you hear what I just said? It still may go higher. Still slamming into major resistance levels in this area. Possibly overthrow them. Nvidia is just below major resistance in the weekly time frame. Where NASDAQ moves slightly above this high, so far the S&P is not. The S&P may join the NASDAQ going into next week at some point. But it is possible that they diverge from one another, is so often the case. Slightly above that previous peak from July 31st. We'll now be watching today's gap. We keep getting these, and we may see another one. We may gap higher come Monday, getting these gaps higher, but then we see it, the rally fade into the session. Keep seeing this over and over. But keep this in mind, and keep in mind that we're above that upper band as I'm going to show you the weekly charts, and we're slamming into the resistance. It's still possible we overthrow the resistance levels a little bit, but we are hitting them. So we moved above the 78.6 Fibonacci here, and then we exceeded it and got 100% retracement, over 100%, recovering the entire decline over here, slamming into the upper Bollinger Band, slamming into resistance yet again on NASDAQ 100. I don't know if this means anything. It may not. Sometimes it counts as trend extensions. Other times they mark reversals. But we have an 8 of a 9 on the 60-minute chart for the NASDAQ with this test higher above our upper band. It was a 13 over here that marked the peak. It was a 9 over here that marked the bottom. Whether this count plays out, we get a 9, or we go a little higher and get the 9 here in the 60-minute time frame, I have no idea. Times the counts play out. Other times marking a reversal. Other times they just mark short-term pullbacks, or in some cases immediate trend extensions. But for the NASDAQ, we did get an 8 of a 9 in the 60-minute time frame. So the first hour of trading come Monday, we're going to get a 9 count. That doesn't mean necessarily a top. It did mean a bottom over here. The 13 did mean a peak over here, but it doesn't always play out that way. Again, listen carefully. NASDAQ has flipped back to bullish. It could still go higher, completing another reference point of a divergence on the awesome oscillator and maybe on the MACD in the daily time frame. So just be aware of that. But I wanted to make you aware of this count. I have no idea if it'll play out or not. You might get the count and still end up getting a trend extension and going higher. Apple and Nvidia continue to help the NASDAQ for the short term. S&P 60-minute chart has a 7 of a 9 again. And you still see the S&P move to a new high. But I'm just letting you know because NASDAQ's got an 8 of a 9. We have a 7 of a 9 here on the 60-minute chart. And sorry, that was marked the 15-minute chart. This is the 60-minute chart. Here you had a 13. You did get some volatility, ended up going a little higher. And again, you get these rallies where we keep getting these gap and traps where you continue to fade into the rally over here, gap higher. Like out of the last 10 sessions or so, 7 or 8 of them have started higher but ended lower, ended up closing lower. We'll see what happens. By the way, that was a 9 count in the daily time frame. We had it here, went a little bit higher for the Thursday bar on the 31st of July. Sometimes that's the case. Now, again, is this a pullback? We end up trying to go higher. We get a lower high below this level and end up diverging with the NASDAQ. Things to be aware of. This is the S&P daily chart. S&P on Thursday, we gapped up into the 78.6 Fibonacci. This is the 60-minute chart. And we stalled there. We turned down off of it, getting a lower high so far. Then on Friday, we gapped higher and we hit the 78.6 Fib again and overthrew that level yet again. Here, closing just above it. Here, we closed below it and got rejection at it. Well, the NASDAQ moved above the previous July 31st peak. The S&P did not. It still may join the NASDAQ if we end up trying to gap up into this channel or rally up into this channel, I should say, and hit the upper Bollinger Band again and try to take out this high. If they diverge, then I'll be watching. Do we get rejection with a lower high? We had a bear flag pattern. It has evolved into a possible bigger pattern or a new channel that might take us higher. The S&P had formed a channel, a bear flag channel. We broke down from that channel, a bear flag, but then we gapped up and we got a back above it. Now, if the S&P tries to make new highs, we could go up and move into the upper channel here of this parallel channel. But we are forming negative divergences here. It may not be done yet, but again, is what I'm going to be watching as we go into next week. Does the S&P make a lower high and end up diverging with NASDAQ, or does it make a higher high and join NASDAQ? And again, the market is going sideways. This bear flag is either evolving to a larger bear flag or a new channel that could take us into the upper boundary of the channel to try to challenge this high. But so far you have a lower high, divergences, and they may not be done yet. We may still push higher. So again, I'll be watching Friday's gap. I'll be watching what becomes of these divergences in the 15-minute time frame. We have a new rising channel that's going to take the S&P up into this upper boundary, somewhere higher near the upper Bollinger Band in the daily time frame. Joining the NASDAQ, or we'll get a lower high, and we end up seeing a breakdown, still having a bear flag, but it's just expanded into a larger pattern. We are clearly going sideways at the moment. We are in a trading range. NASDAQ slightly above the previous peak, S&P a little bit below it. You got a possible bear flag. Patterns have to be confirmed. You have to break down and then get a confirmation and a follow through in the lower boundary. But you got a possible head and shoulders here is lopsided. That if it were to play out and the S&P were to get a lower high, it would measure down to fill the gap over here. This dotted blue line right there under our 50-period moving average. So again, likely going to see our seasonality play out, but does the S&P end up forming a divergence first, joining the NASDAQ, or do we get a lower high and see them diverge, triggering a August sell-off? MACDs may not turn back up. They may remain bearish. But if the S&P does form a divergence here on the RSI, then there's a possibility that it does try to turn back up. Should the S&P move to a new high, then that would be followed by a sell-off with the divergence. So again, you're going sideways. That's always frustrating because when you go sideways, signals start getting mixed signals. A trending move up, the signals are bullish, and a trending move down, the signals are bearish. When you're going sideways, they go back and forth. So does the S&P join NASDAQ, or does it get that lower high? So what I'll be watching as we go into the next week, where we're going to get the CPI data. To point out that we turned off of major resistance with the rising wedge in the daily and the weekly time frame for NASDAQ, and in the time frame for the S&P, weekly time frame for the S&P, weekly time frame for the NASDAQ. Here in the daily time frame, again, from the 2023 low to our low in April, parallel boundary to the upper boundary here in December. We slammed right into that trend line, reversed off of it with a bearish bell hole candlestick. All right, bring it up close. You can see that. Here's the December high over here going up. And again, we just slammed right into it, broke down July 29th, rallied back up July 31st, back tested the trend line, and then we moved lower, reversing off of this trend line. So after breaking this one, now again, if you do go try to challenge that high, you'll still have this trend line right here, and this is where we reversed in the weekly time frame as well. So there is major resistance here, and you have that upper Bollinger Band directly overhead. The S&P also turned off of our trend lines in the weekly time frame. This is our linear scaling, and the trend line from the 2023 low connected up here. We went up and we broke it, and we slammed right into it, and we just slightly overthrew it just a little bit, and we stalled there the previous week. We rebounded back up to test it, although we did not move to a new high. NASDAQ did, but the S&P closed out the week 151 points higher, rising by 2.43%. So again, if we get the projection surrounding this trend line, it's rising to the further right of the chart we go. So if we do move to a new high, it'll go a little higher. But if we get rejection surrounding this trend line, or the one with our log scaling, again, and see the seasonality play out, which is what I think is likely going to be the case, I do eventually think we'll move towards these trend lines. This is our trend line here from the 2020 low, as I've talked about. 2020 low connected to the 2022, 23 lows, and our April bottom. We hit horizontal support here. This is why I call that bottom. The last week of July, we were coming up and slamming up into these trend lines, and that's why I was calling it top. It's holding on the S&P, but we moved slightly above it on the NASDAQ. Eventually, I think we go to these upper channel lines parallel to the lower boundary, 66 or 6,700, but I do think we will see the seasonality play out. So we're stalling at that channel from the 2023 low in the daily time frame. We're stalling at the channel here from the 2023 low, the trend line that we broke with our linear scaling here in the weekly time frame, and then our log scaling. I've taken the trend line back from the 2020 low, and with the log scaling, I've taken it from the 2022 low. Let me show you that, keeping this trend line in your mind. Here's our log scaling from the 2022 low. And again, look at the highs over here from late 2021 and early 2022 when we peaked over here on the S&P, and that came right up here to the December high, and we just slammed into it last week. We're just below that level. Now, again, we could test it again or even try to slightly overthrow it. It is major resistance. We had a bearish engulfing last week. It was not confirmed. Both NASDAQ and S&P got bearish engulfing candlesticks. They were not confirmed. Candlesticks have to be confirmed to mean anything. Sell off, and then we recovered, and now we're getting a lower high, at least so far, on the S&P and a slightly higher high on the NASDAQ. So some major trend lines of resistance. Again, if we do push higher, this trend line is going to the right of the chart. It's rising, so we still may exceed our peak from July 31st, because in the daily time frame, we don't have confirmation and a follow-through. Now we're seeing signals turn back to bullish after turning bearish the previous week with that sell-off. So again, major resistance. So far, all it has done is just stall the rally. We haven't seen a big firmed reversal in that we get confirmation and a follow through, only on a confirmation bar one day in the daily time frame. So I'll be watching this trend line. Eventually, I think we make it to this upper channel line parallel to the lower boundary, and again, likely taking us towards 66 or 6700 for the top. Here we hit the mid 6400 area. NASDAQ, again, still slamming into some resistance. We have here our linear scaling in the weekly time frame. The NASDAQ, here I've drawn a parallel boundary from the low here in 2023 to our April low in 2025, and then this point here parallel to the point here in December of 2024. We came up and we slammed up into it last week, and then again this week we've moved slightly higher. Last week we had a down week and a bearish engulfing. It did not get confirmed. This week we go up and we slam into this level. We may even overthrow it. It is resistance here in the weekly time frame. Still marking this as a wave 1, 2, and a 3, and a 4. Maybe again we're just getting a delayed reaction to the seasonality. I still think you're going to get an August sell-off, but you're slamming into some major resistance. These weekly time frames on both NASDAQ and S&P, Nvidia is doing the same. Eventually, I think we'll see some kind of sell-off and then go up and probably hit this trend line again, or again, maybe even overthrow it. We'll be watching. Do we get rejection here? Do we overthrow this level a little bit as we're above that upper Bollinger Band already in the daily time frame? This is our linear scaling. Now look at our log scaling. Here's our log scaling, and we come right up and slam into the trend line right here from the higher low in 2023 to this trend line right here. And then we broke it with the sell-off, came back to support. This is where I call the bottom, major support. And right here, I'm looking for a top because we're slamming into this trend. It just says this trend line acted as support, so this trend line is going to act as resistance, and that's why I told you I'm looking for a peak here. Again, maybe we overthrow this level a little bit. We've slightly done so 3 weeks ago and then turned off of it last week. Here we're slamming up into it again. If we complete a wave 3 at some point next week, because we did move to a new high, then again I think you'll get wave 4 and 5 going into September or October, closer to this trend line right here. But right now we're stalling at the trend line here with our log scaling up and slamming right into it yet again as we slam into this trend line with our linear scaling. And remember, Nvidia is hitting that long-term log scaling trend line. It's just under it. You can inch a little higher and slam into it, getting a direct hit or even overthrow it a little bit, but that is a major long-term trend line. Stopping tail on Nvidia did not play out the previous week. These reversal bars we had in the weekly time frame on NASDAQ and S&P, they did not play out, which were bearish engulfing candlesticks. There was no confirmation. Watching these trend lines of resistance, see if the advance does end up stalling. And again, does the NASDAQ 100 diverge with the S&P, or does the S&P join NASDAQ 100 to try to make a new high before we see a bigger pullback, which is likely going to happen in August with our seasonality? Right now, we're going sideways. NASDAQ 100's moved slightly higher, S&P slightly lower, at least so far. The Dow and the Russell still have lower highs.